That's true. If I remember, I think the stage band started sometime around in the 70s when I was.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you learned to play? Who were your influence, and how did you get it?
Well, I remember it. I started to play when I was 15, and in Philadelphia, uh, there was amongst the white saxophone players, the hero was Al Cohn.
Hmm.
All the guys idolized him. So I started to, you know, I'd run into Frank Taveri, who was really an Al Cohn guy in those days, before his Coltrane reality,
Huh.
and he said, "Oh," and I couldn't afford many records, so he said, "Try this, get this record." So I listened to it, and so when I first started to play, I never forgot my first attempt at playing the tenor saxophone. I had a Cohn 10M, a Brillhart number 4 hard rubber mouthpiece, and a symmetric cut reed. I don't know if you remember those. It's probably before your time. And I knew exactly the sound I wanted to get. And I worked at it. And about 4 hours later, I had a sound that was approximated what I heard in my head, which is a good lesson. Like a lot of young players, they start out, they have no idea what they want to sound like. So they can practice 8 hours a day and they can't quite figure out what they're trying to do. Anyway, I got into that, and then and then all of a sudden I started to hear Sonny Rollins and Coltrane. For a while, I was a Coltrane clone, believe it or not.
Huh.
I could actually approximate sound, and so I get on the bandstand and try to be somebody I wasn't. When I said, "Well, there's something wrong with this picture," here I'm, like coming from a different background, and trying to play like Train. I mean, it was like early Train. So, and then I would hear a lot of guys, hear a lot of white tenor players trying to play like that. I said, but they sound terrible, man. I said, maybe I sound just as bad, but I don't think I did. I think I was doing okay, but I realized that there's something wrong with my whole approach. So there was a older, older than me, older guy, trombone player who had a record collection, invited me to his place, and he played me all the classic tenor players. I never heard all the great players. He played Lester Young. I mean, like Lester Young is perfection. I mean, you hear Lester Young and it's like, wow. And there's nothing, you wouldn't change a note. Playing Ben Webster, I never heard anything like that. Don Bias. I mean, I never heard anybody play the tenor like that. I mean, he was the master of the tenor. He played all these guys and got to Coleman Hawkins, and it was too hard for me. Can you
Huh.
imagine going from Coltrane to Coleman Hawkins? And Hawkins was, the sound concept, time, and the harmonically, and he was so complicated. I mean, Hawkins was incredibly difficult. I mean, in a way, maybe more difficult than Bird. And so, anyway, I listened to all this stuff, and I started to do some investigation. I heard Chu Berry, and I said, "Man, that's special too." And then eventually, the light bulb went off years later, and Hawkins kind of said, "Well, that's I really was I was too young to appreciate it." All of a sudden, I realized the greatness of Hawkins, and he was like basically the root of the whole thing. He was the source, put it that way. So I listened to all these players, and I tried to absorb certain essence from these players, not necessarily transcribing stuff, but trying to get the spirit. Like you listen to Lester, and there's a certain buoyancy that you hear. You listen to Ben Wester's. Tosco has a great description. She calls it tragic beauty.
Huh.
You know, Ben Wester is so dark, man. Like it's a deep world. I can tell you a story about my involvement with that, but uh, anyway, I tried to absorb certain elements of all these players, and then when I heard Sonny Rollins, who was a hero of mine, and I could hear all of a sudden I could hear all those elements coming out of his horn, the revelation was that if you take all these influences and you put them in a pot, and you mix it up, and eventually you find, your own thing comes out of it. I mean, you can always hear influences, but basically you find your own voice. Pepper Adams had a line. He said, if you copy one or two players, it's plagiarism. If you copy a lot of people, it's called research. So it was like it was, So that's how things started, percolating. And and eventually, when I hit 40 years old, I remember playing in Nice Jazz Festival, and Jimmy Heath came over to me. He said, "Man, like something happened, man. Your sound is so, changed, and you're playing so much. You're really playing great. Blah blah blah." And he said, "But you're 40 years old." And I started to think about it, and I think when you hit around 40, I mean, this is a generalization, of course. When you hit around 40, you find you begin to accept your idiosyncrasy. Before, you try to get rid of it. You don't want to. You kind of what you do kind of is annoying because it doesn't sound exactly like all the people that you like. But you learn to accept your idiosyncrasy, and then you can begin to develop, your solidify your own approach. So you're not just a copy, you know. And I, years, many years later, not many years later, but when I was in New York. I guess I was around late 20, 27, whatever. I was hanging out with, I went to hear Zoot Sims, and he came off the bandstand and he said, man, it's the first time in my life I feel confident about my playing, and I'm thinking, I said, Zoot Sims, man. I mean, he always sounded great, and I couldn't believe it. That he confided in me, some young, nobody. He confided in me. And then years later, I realized that he was probably at that time around 40. And he began to feel comfortable in his own skin, which, to an outsider, it seemed ridiculous because he sounded great for so many years. But in his mind, he found like he finally felt like he arrived. So there's a whole evolution that takes place, in most people. When you look at it this way, in the old days, people played like they played all the time. They played like every night, in clubs and
Right.
concerts. So your development is quicker. So by the time you're 30, 20, late 20s, you're on your way. But in the later years, you don't have that kind of reality. It takes much longer.
That,
It's
that,
a slower process. I mean, and you can look at Bird, but that's the exception. That's not the standard reality.
that's exactly what Frank West told me. Actually, when I used to talk with West about stuff, and he said, back then, we were playing all of the time. He said the Basie band had 300 dates. He said I was playing all day, playing all night. He actually said, you guys will never be able to play like we did. It won't happen again.
Yeah, I mean, it was a different reality, and so we have to look at it in a different way. So it takes some of us longer. Like I always consider myself a work in progress, and like even in my geriatric reality. So I'm still thinking the same way, like trying to get it right. And what else are you going to do? And.
But I really enjoy that solo that on the rhythm changes there that you played.
I used to have to start out that this particular tune. Now that I think about it, it's A flat. A flat. I've got rhythm. Okay. Now we do it. We go on tour like wherever I have to play it.
Right.
I say to the guy next to me, the alto player, third alto player, I said, okay, what note should I start on? You start out playing like it's not that like you're playing a cadenza before you start. Like, you know, you're starting right on one or whatever.
Right.
And so I say, give me a note. Now, of course, you give me the most ridiculous note to start on, like an A or something. It's okay. It's like, because you have to choose the first note. The hardest thing to do is to choose the first note.
Right.
So I let him choose the first note and deal with it. So it's an interesting when you're put in that position. You can. I mean, you could. We had guys, and I hate to say this, we had guys coming through our band that would play the same solo every night. You know, young guys. You know, I said, why they do that? You know, so you could do that. You could play the same solo all the time. It would become a part of the chart, like, you know, like that we know in history, like, you know, Duke's band. But I used to, I welcome the challenge, you know,
Right.
somehow.
It's the same thing in the Basie band. I remember, John Williams, the baritone player, used to say that. He said, over my 40 years in the band, we had some guys they played the same solo every night, and then
Yeah, right.
you have other guys that come up. It's always something different. But he said that's just part of the music. And I do agree when you're touring with the band a lot and it's playing a lot, the solo becomes part of the chart if the guy sticks to the similar
Yeah, it can
solo.
become part of it. It can become part of a chart. There's certain things that,
Right.
you know, yeah, I mean, but in this band, our band, like, it was a combination of a big band and a small group.
Hmm.
So there's the big band, you know, the ensemble. But when the guy got up to play a solo, all of a sudden it's a small group. So everything had to change. And it drove one one of our actually our first permanent drummer. It drove him nuts in the beginning. He says, I can't do it, man. I've got to play the ensemble. And then I got all these horn players and they all play different. And I have to play accompany them. He'd be like Britt Woman was in the band in the beginning. I had
Hmm.
to play with Britt. I've got to play with you. I've got to play with this guy. I said, "Oh, it's cool, man. Just relax." And finally, you know, he had an epiphany. Is that the right word? And everything worked out. But it was like the concept of the band was to be a big band, but when the guy got up to play a solo, it was a small group. Forget about the big band. So that was the concept.
That's cool.
So you couldn't, you know, although there were a couple guys that still managed to play the same solo, and I couldn't believe it. That and the young guys too, you know, why would you want to do that?
Hmm. Hmm. That's interesting, though.
But they didn't last too long.
Oh,
Although some of them did. Some of them went on to become really very successful studio guys. So
oh,
that's cool. You know.
right. Hey, man. The business was changing a lot by the 70s. Things were changing, and then the 80s things were changing even more. And
Well,
I
they're always changing. It's constant. You know, constant change, and I don't know what future holds. But I remember coming to New York at the end of when there was still a studio scene. You know, guys played in. That's how I used to be. Like I used to be Joe Farrell's sub.
hmm,
So when I came to New York, I played with Elvin one night. I sat in with Elvin, and he started sending me in to play with Elvin when he couldn't do it, and then he sent me in the Thad Jones band and all that kind of that kind of stuff, and because he was busy doing studio work.
hmm,
Anyway, there'd be like you go to see Thad Jones and Mel Lewis in the course of the course of an evening. The trumpet section would change. This guy moves, comes in. This guy goes out. You know, they're all coming from dates and whatever. It was a different world. Saxophone repairman. It was a saxophone repairman. His name was Nick Engelman. Guys would come in between dates. Oh, my this pad is leaking. And he would get guys. You know, he would have their horn able. You know, ready for the next gig. There was no. That was his function to keep guys active. So there was a studio scene. So that died, and things changed, and they're always changing.
yeah. Well, sometimes not for the better. Now you got
Oh
me
yeah,
interested. You got me interested now because sometimes you got me
we won't
interested.
talk about that.
Right? Not a lot of people I've talked to, new Joe Farrell, at least in the crowd that I hung with, and he was one of the cats I was listening to back in high school because he was on a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of records. So
Yeah.
can you tell me how well you knew Joe? What was he like?
Well, he was a weird guy. I mean, he was for some reason. For some reason, he liked me, and but he didn't talk to people. He was kind of I don't know. He was a not a sociable guy, and so we hang out. Like I always have my horn. I always have my leather bag. Over my shoulder in those days.
Hmm.
So I'd be hanging out. We'd be hanging out. And he said, "Oh man, go play with this guy. Why don't you go play with him?" So I go up and play. So I'm playing, and I look around. And Sonny Rollins is in the club. I said, "Oh, I know he set me up for this." You know, so, we used to hang out. He was, he was, we had a nice relationship in a way. He liked, he was a flute major, and he liked my flute playing, and
Right.
so we were cool, and you know, he was nice to me. I remember I remember one time I had a little group. We're trying to do a gig in outdoors, and we needed a couple drums. So he said, "Oh, Elvin's got all his drums in my house. You can. I don't think you would mind if you took them. We borrow Elvin's drums to do a little bar gig."
Wow.
Elvin was really a nice. He was really a nice guy. He was beautiful.